August 1942. Deep inside the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul, a message arrives from the Solomon Islands. It is short, confusing, and impossible to believe. A Japanese officer reads the numbers again, then again. Finally, he looks up and quietly says something many others in the room are already thinking. This report must be wrong. According to the message, an entire Japanese assault force has been almost completely destroyed during a night attack on American positions near Guadalcanal. Hundreds of soldiers are dead. Survivors are scattered or missing. The attack has collapsed. For Japanese commanders in 1942, the report makes no sense. For nearly 40 years, Japan had built a powerful belief about its soldiers and its enemies. That belief began in 1905 during the Battle of Tsushima. When the Imperial Japanese Navy destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet, it was more than just a victory. It became proof in the minds of many Japanese leaders that spirit could defeat size, wealth, and industrial power. Japanese officers began teaching that victory did not come from numbers or equipment. It came from discipline, courage, and a willingness to die before surrendering. These ideas were tied closely to a modern interpretation of Bushido, the warrior code associated with the samurai. Young officers were taught that Japanese soldiers possessed a unique fighting spirit. Western armies, they believed, relied on machines, comfort, and firepower. Japanese soldiers relied on endurance and sacrifice. At first, history seemed to prove them right. Japanese forces fought long campaigns in China and repeatedly defeated larger armies. Then, in December 1941, the war expanded dramatically when Japan launched the surprise strike on the American fleet during the attack on Pearl Harbor. What followed was one of the fastest military expansions in modern history. Japanese forces captured Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, and Singapore within months. British and American defenses collapsed again and again. Entire colonial armies surrendered. Across Asia and the Pacific, Japanese soldiers seemed unstoppable. Each victory strengthened a dangerous assumption inside Japanese command circles. If Western armies kept losing, then the explanation seemed obvious. Japanese soldiers fought harder. They endured more. They refused to surrender. American troops in particular were often underestimated in Japanese intelligence reports. Analysts described Americans as physically strong but psychologically soft. Many officers believed American soldiers came from a society too comfortable to tolerate hunger, disease, and exhaustion. One branch of the American military received especially little respect: the United States Marine Corps. Before 1942, the Marines were often seen as small garrison troops stationed on distant islands. Their missions usually involved guarding naval bases or protecting American interests overseas. Compared to the massive armies fighting in Europe and Asia, the Marine Corps appeared small and relatively inexperienced. Japanese planners assumed that if Marines ever faced seasoned Japanese infantry in a jungle battle, the result would be predictable. Aggressive night attacks, fast infiltration through weak points, bayonet charges before the enemy could react. These tactics had worked repeatedly in China. They had shocked British and Dutch forces across Southeast Asia. Japanese commanders believed they would work again against Americans. Then came Guadalcanal. In August 1942, thousands of Marines landed on the island and quickly seized an unfinished Japanese airfield. The Marines renamed it Henderson Field and began building defensive positions around it. Japanese commanders believed the Americans had landed only a limited force. If attacked quickly, they assumed the Marines would withdraw before suffering heavy losses. So, a counterattack was organized. The soldiers selected for the mission were not inexperienced recruits. Many were veterans who had fought for years. They had seen cities burn and armies collapse. They believed the coming battle would be just another victory. What they did not know was that the Marines defending Guadalcanal were not the soldiers Japanese intelligence thought they were. And in just a few hours of fighting in the dark jungle, that misunderstanding would cost hundreds of lives and begin to destroy one of the most powerful myths of the Pacific War. On the night of August 21, 1942, the jungle along the banks of the Tenaru River was silent except for the sound of insects and the distant crash of waves on the shore. Just beyond the dark tree line, several hundred Japanese soldiers were preparing to attack. They belonged to a detachment commanded by Colonel Kianao Ichiki, an officer whose troops were considered among the best in the Imperial Japanese Army. Many of them were veterans of earlier campaigns across Asia. They had been told that the Americans holding the airfield on Guadalcanal were few in number and poorly organized. Japanese intelligence estimated that perhaps 2,000 American troops were on the island. The real number was closer to 11,000. Most of them were Marines from the United States Marine Corps, dug into defensive positions around Henderson Field. They had spent days preparing trenches, sandbag bunkers, and overlapping fields of fire along the approaches to their lines. The Tenaru River formed a natural barrier east of the marine perimeter. In reality, the waterway was more of a sandbar lagoon than a deep river, but it created a narrow crossing point. Marine commanders realized it was the most likely direction for a Japanese attack. Machine guns were positioned to cover the sandbar. Artillery units were placed behind the line. Marines waited in foxholes beneath palm trees and tangled jungle vines, listening to the darkness. Shortly after midnight, the attack began. Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle in formation, shouting and firing as they charged across the sandbar toward the Marine defenses. Many carried rifles with fixed bayonets. Officers believed that speed and aggression would overwhelm the Americans before they could organize an effective defense. Instead, the Marines were already waiting. The moment the first wave reached the open sand, machine guns opened fire. Tracers cut through the darkness. Mortars exploded along the shoreline. Entire sections of the attacking force were struck before they even reached the Marine line. But the Japanese kept coming. For soldiers raised in a military culture that glorified offensive spirit, retreat was almost unthinkable. Groups of infantrymen pushed forward again and again, trying to break through the defensive perimeter. Some reached the barbed wire. Others tried to cross the lagoon at different points under heavy fire. Again and again, they were driven back. By early morning, the battlefield in front of the Marine line was covered with bodies. The sandbar that Japanese troops had believed would be their path to victory had turned into a killing zone. When daylight finally revealed the full scale of the disaster, the surviving Japanese soldiers attempted to regroup inside the nearby jungle. But the battle was not over. Marine units launched a counterattack. Supported by artillery and light tanks, the Marines advanced through coconut groves and dense brush toward the remaining Japanese positions. Small groups of Japanese soldiers fought stubbornly, often refusing to surrender even when surrounded. Some attempted desperate last charges. Others hid in the jungle and fired until their ammunition was gone. By the end of the day, the Ichiki detachment had been almost completely destroyed. Out of roughly 900 soldiers who had taken part in the assault, only a small number survived to retreat west into the jungle. Colonel Ichiki himself did not survive the battle. For Japanese commanders back at Rabaul, the reports arriving from Guadalcanal were difficult to accept. The Imperial Japanese Army had expected a quick victory against what it believed was a weak American force.
Instead, one of its elite detachments had been wiped out in a single night. Even more disturbing was the way the battle had unfolded. The Marines had not panicked, they had not abandoned their positions. Under a sudden night assault, they had held their ground and used prepared defenses to devastating effect. This was not the behavior Japanese officers expected from American troops. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese commanders began to suspect that their understanding of the enemy might be wrong. But the lesson was not immediately accepted. Instead, reconsidering their assumptions, many officers believed the failure at Tenaru was simply the result of poor planning or bad luck. If a larger and better coordinated force attacked, they believed the outcome would be different. More troops were already being prepared for Guadalcanal, and the battles that followed would become far larger, far more brutal, and far more shocking than anyone on either side had imagined.
After the disaster at the Tenaru River, Japanese commanders still refused to believe that the Americans on Guadalcanal were capable of stopping a determined offensive. To them, the destruction of Colonel Ichiki's detachment was an unfortunate mistake, not a warning. The solution seemed obvious: send more troops, attack again. Over the following weeks, Japanese forces began reinforcing the island. Warships slipped down the narrow waters of what Allied sailors would later call the slot, delivering soldiers, ammunition, and supplies under the cover of darkness. The goal was simple: crush the Americans before they could strengthen their defenses around Henderson Field. But while Japanese commanders prepared their next attack, the Marines were preparing as well. Inside the defensive perimeter surrounding the airfield, thousands of men from the United States Marine Corps worked day and night digging deeper trenches and building stronger positions. Coconut logs, sandbags, and steel gun mounts were arranged to create overlapping lines of fire. Every approach through the jungle was studied carefully. The Marines understood something important about the coming battle. The Japanese preferred to attack at night. Night assaults had been extremely effective in earlier campaigns. Japanese infantry were trained to move quietly through jungle terrain, infiltrate weak points in enemy defenses, and suddenly overwhelm their opponents with close combat and bayonet charges. But Guadalcanal would not be like those earlier battlefields. The Marines built their defenses specifically to stop that kind of attack. Machine guns were placed so that each one protected the others. Artillery observers memorized the jungle terrain around the perimeter. Flares were prepared to turn darkness into sudden daylight the moment an attack began. The first major test came in late August. Japanese forces under General Kiyotake Kawaguchi moved through the thick jungle south of Henderson Field, planning a large night assault against what they believed was a weak section of the Marine line. The terrain was brutal. Dense forest, steep ridges, and mud slowed movement to a crawl. Supplies were limited, but Japanese officers believed surprise and determination would make the difference. Late on the night of September 12th, the attack began along a narrow ridge overlooking the Marine defenses. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charged uphill toward Marine positions. Officers shouted commands in the darkness as rifle fire and explosions echoed through the jungle. For a moment, it seemed possible that the Japanese might actually break through. Some Marine positions were nearly overrun, but the defenders held. Machine guns hammered the slopes. Mortars exploded among the attacking formations. Marines fired from foxholes only a few meters from the advancing enemy. The fighting became chaotic and brutal, with soldiers battling in near darkness along muddy jungle paths. One of the most famous moments of the battle unfolded at a machine gun position manned by Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone. As the Japanese assault intensified, Basilone's section became one of the key points holding the defensive line together. Under constant attack, several of his gun crews were killed or wounded. Ammunition lines were cut. At one point, two of the machine guns jammed under the stress of continuous firing. Instead of abandoning the position, Basilone moved between the guns himself, clearing jams, directing fire, and reorganizing the defense, while enemy soldiers pushed dangerously close to the Marine line. At one point, he reportedly ran through heavy fire to retrieve additional ammunition so the guns could keep firing. Through the long night, the machine guns never fell silent. Elsewhere along the perimeter, Marines fought similar desperate battles to keep the Japanese from breaking through. Flares burst above the jungle canopy, casting harsh white light across the battlefield. In that sudden illumination, Marines could see groups of Japanese soldiers rushing forward through smoke and palm trees. Again and again, the attacks were stopped. By morning, the slopes in front of the Marine positions were covered with the bodies of Japanese soldiers who had tried to break the line. For the second time on Guadalcanal, a determined Japanese night assault had failed. But something more important had changed. Japanese soldiers who survived these battles began reporting something unexpected about the Americans they were fighting. The Marines did not collapse under pressure the way Japanese commanders had predicted. They did not abandon positions when attacked at night. Instead, they seemed to grow more dangerous. The defensive firepower of the Marines shocked many Japanese troops. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery were coordinated in ways that made direct assaults extremely costly. Even when wounded, many Marines continued fighting from their positions. Stories like these began spreading among Japanese units on the island. And slowly, the image of the American soldier that had existed inside Japanese military thinking for decades began to change. The enemy they had expected to face, soft, inexperienced, unwilling to endure hardship, did not seem to exist here in the jungles around Henderson Field. Instead, they had encountered something very different, an enemy that refused to break. By mid-September 1942, Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal were beginning to realize that the Americans were unlike any enemy they had ever faced. Reports from survivors trickled back to Rabaul, describing soldiers who fought through exhaustion, hunger, and wounds. Words like unyielding and relentless began appearing in dispatches, something that unsettled even the most seasoned Japanese officers. Inside the jungle, the reality was even harsher. Japanese troops were cut off from steady supply lines. Food and ammunition were scarce, and the tropical climate was relentless. Hot days, humid nights, constant rain, and disease. Malaria, dysentery, and infections spread among units already weakened by combat. Soldiers began keeping crude diaries, counting how many days they could survive on what little food remained. Some recorded every minor wound, each encounter with Marines, calculating their chances of living another day. Others created survival calendars, marking days without sleep or proper meals, a testament to the brutal arithmetic of life and death in the jungle. Despite these hardships, retreat was rarely an option. Many soldiers were bound by a code of honor deeply ingrained over decades of military indoctrination. Death in battle was preferred over capture, and surrender carried a stigma too great to bear. When they encountered Americans, some Japanese troops continued fighting even when their lines had collapsed or when they were alone in the jungle. Accounts describe men firing from hidden positions, sometimes after being bayoneted or shot multiple times, refusing to abandon their post. One particularly striking example was the Solomon Islands scout Jacob Vuza. Captured by Japanese soldiers while observing American movements, he endured brutal torture, yet survived to warn the Marines of a pending attack. His testimony later revealed the extreme discipline and stubbornness of Japanese troops, even in the face of near-certain death. Soldiers on both sides were forced to confront the sheer determination of their enemies. Meanwhile, the Marines' disciplined defensive tactics continued to inflict devastating casualties. Machine guns swept jungle trails, mortars thundered through ridges, and sniper teams eliminated small groups attempting to regroup. Japanese soldiers witnessed firsthand that the Marines did not panic, did not flee, and often counterattacked aggressively. This was entirely contrary to the reports that Japanese officers had relied upon for decades, which had painted Americans as psychologically fragile. The psychological effect on the Japanese troops was profound. Some soldiers began to express fear openly, something rarely seen in a culture that prized bravery and composure. Letters and diaries from the time reveal a mix of confusion, admiration, and terror. One officer later wrote that facing the Marines was like fighting a force that had no fear of death, no limits to its endurance. Others described a sense of helplessness, realizing that their training and experience might not be enough to prevail. Survival became a daily calculation. Soldiers shared what little food they had, scavenged from abandoned positions or the jungle floor. Each day brought new encounters with illness, exhaustion, and relentless Marine patrols. Units attempted to regroup after failed assaults, only to discover that the Marines had anticipated their movements. Ambushes, well-placed machine guns, and artillery made the jungle a lethal maze. Amid this struggle, individual acts of courage emerged on both sides. Japanese soldiers risked their lives to carry messages, rescue comrades, or sabotage Marine positions. They displayed extraordinary determination even when hope was nearly gone. Marines, in turn, were inspired by these acts, respecting the tenacity of an enemy that refused to quit. By late September, the Japanese soldiers' sense of shock only deepened. Officers who had always relied on experience and doctrine found themselves questioning everything. The jungle seemed endless, the Marines seemed everywhere, and every attack ended in the same devastating losses. Some Japanese troops began to whisper that perhaps the Americans were not just disciplined, they were almost unstoppable. Even as the Japanese High Command continued to plan reinforcements, the soldiers on the ground began to understand a bitter truth. Their previous victories in China, Singapore, and the Philippines meant little here. The Marines were unlike any opponent they had ever faced. They were prepared, adaptive, and utterly unafraid. The jungle itself became a crucible. Disease, heat, and relentless combat stripped men to their most basic instincts. Each day became a battle for survival, each night a test of courage. Soldiers measured life not in victories, but in how many days they could endure under impossible conditions. The Marines had not only survived, they had thrived under pressure, setting the stage for the even larger battles yet to come. By the end of this chapter, the soldiers' journals, letters, and post-war testimonies all tell the same story. Guadalcanal was not just a battlefield, it was a mirror showing Japanese troops the truth about their enemy, a truth that challenged every assumption they had held about the Americans' fighting spirit and the very nature of warfare itself. For the first time, they faced an opponent that refused to break, refused to flee, and forced them to confront the horrifying reality of a war they had thought they understood. By October 1942, the battle for Guadalcanal had become something far more than a clash of soldiers. It had become a test of assumptions, courage, and endurance. Japanese commanders, unwilling to accept the staggering losses from previous attacks, began pouring reinforcements into the island. General Kiyotake Kawaguchi arrived with fresh troops and detailed plans for a decisive night assault. His orders were clear: crush the American defenders and restore Japanese honor. Many soldiers still believed that sheer courage and the willingness to die would secure victory. but Guadalcanal would prove them catastrophically wrong. The Marines defending Henderson Field were prepared. Every trail, ridge, and coconut grove had been studied and fortified. Machine guns were positioned to cover overlapping fields of fire. Mortars were ready to target any concentration of troops, and artillery observers kept watch for movement. Flares hung in the ready, capable of turning night into day in an instant, destroying the advantage Japanese troops had long relied upon in jungle warfare. The dense jungle, once considered cover, had become a gauntlet for advancing forces. When Kawaguchi's troops launched their assault in late October, the Japanese soldiers moved cautiously through the dark, humid jungle, carrying rifles, grenades, and minimal supplies. They expected fear and disarray from the Americans, but they encountered something else entirely. Machine guns opened fire as they emerged into the open, cutting down wave after wave. Mortars and grenades rained down in carefully calculated patterns. Attempts to flank or infiltrate were anticipated and countered with precision. Entire platoons were wiped out before they could reach the Marine lines. Survivors later described the chaos in harrowing detail. Soldiers were shot as they advanced, tripped over tangled roots, or drowned in swampy areas while attempting to cross the mangrove-lined creeks. Some tried to hide in the jungle for hours or even days, paralyzed by fear, watching comrades fall one after another. Others continued to fight despite wounds that would have forced retreat in any other situation. One account tells of a soldier who, after being bayoneted multiple times, dragged himself forward to reload a rifle, determined to protect his position. Meanwhile, the Marines displayed extraordinary resilience and tactical skill. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone held a critical machine gun position throughout the assault, clearing jams, redistributing ammunition, and coordinating his men while under relentless enemy fire. Small units of Marines patrolled the jungle, intercepted Japanese movements, and used flares and pre-sighted artillery to annihilate approaching forces. Scouts like Jacob Vuza risked their lives to warn of attacks, ensuring that the Marines were rarely surprised. Each act of American ingenuity magnified the terror for Japanese troops who had believed the Marines were weak or inexperienced. The psychological toll on Japanese soldiers was staggering. They had been trained to endure, to fight, and to die without hesitation, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for this level of resistance. Fear became pervasive. Letters and diaries reveal soldiers questioning everything they had been taught, admitting that the Americans fought with a discipline, courage, and endurance that seemed impossible. One officer wrote that the Marines moved like spirits, unbroken, unyielding, untouchable. Another described nights spent listening to continuous gunfire, realizing that any attempt to advance could be their last. Losses mounted, entire battalions were decimated, supply lines were disrupted, and the terrain itself became an enemy. Jungle diseases like malaria and dysentery weakened men already exhausted from combat. Officers struggled to maintain cohesion, and small groups of soldiers often acted independently, fighting desperately but ineffectively. Retreat was not an option. Japanese doctrine demanded perseverance and valor, leaving men trapped between the orders they could not disobey and the deadly reality around them. As days turned to weeks, the cumulative effect became undeniable. Japanese troops on Guadalcanal faced the brutal truth. Their traditional strategies, honed over decades of victories in China, Singapore, and the Philippines, were ineffective against the Americans. Night attacks, infiltration tactics, and bayonet charges no longer guaranteed success. The Marines' defensive preparation, adaptability, and sheer determination had transformed the battlefield into a killing ground. Strategically, the consequences were monumental. Guadalcanal shifted from a small skirmish to a turning point in the Pacific War. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Supply losses were devastating, morale plummeted, and the High Command was forced to confront the failure of decades of assumptions. The myth of Japanese invincibility, built on Tsushima and decades of unchallenged victories, was shattered. On the ground, the battle became a daily test of survival. Soldiers rationed food, scavenged ammunition, and tended to wounds while under constant threat. Jungle fever, hunger, and exhaustion stripped men of their energy and hope. Each day, some soldiers crawled miles to warn comrades of impending attacks. Others died alone in the mud and underbrush, their bravery unnoticed, their lives reduced to survival by sheer will. By the end of the campaign, the lessons were unmistakable. Courage alone could not guarantee victory. Discipline, preparation, firepower, and coordination were just as critical. The Americans had held their ground and inflicted losses that Japan could not ignore. Guadalcanal had become a harsh school, teaching the Japanese military that underestimating an enemy could lead to catastrophic consequences. As the smoke finally cleared, the Imperial Japanese Army had faced an enemy it could no longer dismiss. The soldiers who survived carried with them the memory of relentless Marines, a jungle that was as much a weapon as any rifle, and the terrible cost of arrogance and miscalculation. Guadalcanal was more than a battlefield. It was a mirror, reflecting the dangerous myths of invincibility that had driven the Japanese army into repeated disaster. The cost had been tens of thousands of lives, but the lesson was indelibly written. The United States Marines were not to be underestimated, and assumptions, no matter how long held, could kill.